All right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling international perspectives on, well, Vladimir Putin and the whole Ukraine situation and how those views on peace have, kind of shifted over time. We've got some fascinating stuff to unpack.
Definitely.
We've got excerpts from Getting Russia Wrong, A Quarter Century of Putin. That's the full title from the American Conservative. Gives us that historical backdrop,
Mm-hmm.
Then we've got a Chinese piece from NetEase. It digs into potential conditions for peace. From the Russian side, at least that's their take.
Interesting.
And to round things out, some Japanese analysis from Daily Shinsho. They're challenging a few of those common narratives we hear about the war.
That's a really interesting mix. I'm particularly interested in seeing those Chinese and Japanese takes, coming from outside the typical Western viewpoint, how they frame things,
Yeah, exactly. Like, it's easy to get stuck in our own bubbles. So first up, Getting Russia Wrong. This article, it really digs into how the U.S. saw Putin way back when, in those early years. It's kind of wild to see how much optimism there was at first.
Yeah, it does seem surprising now, doesn't it? But you got to think about the context, right?
Yeah.
End of the Cold War, everyone wanted a new era of cooperation.
Mm-hmm.
So there was this hope that, maybe a partnership with a newly democratic Russia was possible.
Right.
And there were things Putin did early on, like cooperating after 9/11, that kind of fueled that hope.
Right. So it wasn't just blind optimism. There were actual things making people think, okay, maybe he's the real deal.
Yeah.
But then, as the article lays out, things started changing, particularly between 2007 and 2012. They highlight Putin's speech at the Munich Security Conference, the war in Georgia, and then the whole Libya situation with Gaddafi. Was that Libya intervention really that big of a turning point for Putin, do you think, in terms of how he saw the West? I mean, he was already showing signs of, wanting to assert Russia's power, wasn't he?
Oh, absolutely. He was already pushing back against what he saw as Western encroachment.
Mm-hmm.
But I think Libya was a real turning point for a couple of reasons.
Okay.
First, it solidified his distrust of Western intentions.
Huh.
The U.S. and its allies went beyond the UN mandate in Libya, which was supposed to be about protecting civilians, right? And they actively pushed for regime change. And it reinforced Putin's belief that, the West couldn't be trusted to keep its word.
Interesting.
And then second, the way Gaddafi was killed after being captured, humiliated, that really shook Putin. I think he saw it as a warning, almost, like a preview of what could happen to him if he showed weakness.
Wow. I hadn't thought about it like that. The article doesn't specifically say that Gaddafi's death was a personal turning point for Putin, but
right.
That makes a lot of sense given what he did afterward.
Yeah. It's one of those details that when you connect it to the bigger picture, it really helps you understand, Putin's motivations.
Right, right.
And his kind of hardening stance toward the West.
Yeah.
And this leads us right into that next phase, right? Putin's return for a third term as president.
And the West's complete meltdown, as Getting Russia Wrong puts it.
Yeah.
They were predicting his downfall, weren't they? Saying he couldn't hold on to power with all the protests in Moscow.
Yeah. There were a lot of prominent voices in the West who were just convinced Putin's days were numbered. They pointed to the protests, obviously, and the economic challenges Russia was facing, and this assumption that, the Russian people they must be yearning for change. But they fundamentally misunderstood Putin's regime, and how Russian politics actually work.
Yeah. The article even mentions how U.S. law enforcement agents were picking up chatter about Putin's likely return.
Oh, wow.
While the experts in the White House seemed totally clueless. Seems like a pretty big intelligence failure.
It does raise questions, yeah, about the quality of intelligence and analysis at the time. But I think it also speaks to this broader tendency in the West, to kind of project our own values and expectations onto other countries.
Right.
Particularly those with different political systems. We assume that, because we value democracy and freedom, everyone else must too. And when a leader like Putin defies those expectations, we struggle to understand why.
That tendency to project our values, it definitely comes through in that anecdote from Getting Russia Wrong about Obama's speechwriter gushing over that photo.
Oh, yeah.
Of Obama and Medvedev having burgers together.
It's such a striking example of how personal relationships and, wishful thinking can really cloud judgment, especially in diplomacy. The Obama administration, they seem to think that by, building a relationship with Medvedev, they could somehow moderate Putin's behavior.
Right.
But that assumption was just naive.
So basically that's how the U.S. got Russia wrong.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
They misjudged Putin's character, underestimated his resilience, and They failed to grasp those deep-seated historical and geopolitical factors driving his actions.
And now we're dealing with the consequences in Ukraine.
Oh yeah, those missteps, they're definitely playing a role in the current conflict, But understanding how we got here, well, that's only part of the story.
Right. It's not just a US-Russia thing anymore. It's global now, right? Global consequences.
Exactly.
So let's look at those other perspectives, starting with that Nudis article.
Okay.
They outline some potential conditions for peace coming from the Russian side, and, well, they're pretty demanding.
Yeah, they are. The article cites sources close to the Kremlin and suggests that Russia's looking for some pretty major concessions from Ukraine.
Like what?
Well, like permanent neutrality limits on the size and scope of their military and recognition of Russia's territorial claims.
Permanent neutrality. Huh, that sounds like a big sticking point. I mean, what would that even mean for Ukraine, in practical terms?
Well, essentially, it'd mean that Ukraine couldn't join NATO or any other military alliance that Russia sees as a threat.
Right.
It would probably also involve restrictions on, what kinds of weapon systems Ukraine could have and where they could deploy their troops.
So basically a way for Russia to try to guarantee its own security.
Exactly, by limiting Ukraine's ability to act as a Western proxy.
Which, given, the history we just talked about, makes sense from their perspective.
Yeah.
Though it's tough to imagine Ukraine agreeing to that after everything that's happened.
Absolutely. It really highlights how hard it is to find a compromise, one that addresses both sides' security concerns.
Right. And then you have the Japanese analysis from Daily Shinsho, which throws another wrench in things.
Right.
They're challenging this idea you hear a lot in the West that Russia's economy is about to implode because of the war and the sanctions.
Yeah, I found that really interesting, too.
So what are they saying? Are they saying the sanctions are ineffective?
Well, they're not saying they're ineffective, but they argue that the West has kind of overestimated their impact
Okay.
and underestimated Russia's resilience, and its ability to adapt.
Mm-hmm.
They point to things like Russia's growing trade with China and India, its success in getting around some of the sanctions using these shadow fleets.
Shadow fleets.
Yeah, basically networks of ships and companies used to obscure where the Russian oil is coming from and going to.
Oh, wow.
And then Russia's also working on developing alternative financial systems that bypass Western institutions.
So they're saying Russia's doing better economically than we think.
Yeah, that's the picture they're painting.
Yeah.
But why would Daily Shinsho take that stance? What's in it for Japan?
Right. What are their interests here?
Well, Japan's got its own complicated interests in this conflict. They've historically had a pretty tense relationship with Russia, stemming from territorial disputes. And, Russia's close ties with China, who Japan sees as its main rival.
Oh.
So on the one hand, they support containing Russia, and they see the war as a potential threat to their own security. But on the other hand, they're also worried about what happens if Russia's totally isolated and weakened, that could create a power vacuum for China to exploit.
So by pointing out that Russia's economy isn't collapsing, they're maybe trying to encourage the West to be more cautious.
Yeah, exactly. They might be trying to temper expectations of a quick Russian collapse.
That's really nuanced.
It seems like everyone is trying to walk this fine line, figuring out where their interests align and where they clash. And then you've got Trump coming back into the picture, which adds another layer.
Oh, yeah. Both the Niddies and Daily Shinsho articles mention Trump saying he wants to negotiate with Putin directly, which has gotten everyone speculating about what that would even look like. Would it be any different from what Biden's doing?
Right. And they both mention it, but they're a little vague on the timelines.
Yeah, they are. Daily Shinsho says a meeting could happen within weeks, while Niddies is a lot vaguer. But the big question is, what kind of leverage does Trump actually have? And would he be willing to lift those sanctions on Russian oil as part of a deal with Putin? Daily Shinsho seemed worried about that.
It's definitely a possibility, and it would be a major point of contention. Lifting those sanctions would be huge for Russia. But the U.S.'s European allies who depend on Russian energy, they'd probably be pretty unhappy.
Yeah, seems like there are so many different interests and potential problems. It's hard to imagine any negotiation making everyone happy. It's like we're at this crossroads, right? So many ways this could go, and none of them are easy or guaranteed.
Yeah, it really is. And as we're trying to, make sense of all these different perspectives, these potential outcomes, we got to remember that there are real people, at the heart of this conflict.
It's easy to get caught up in all the geopolitical stuff and forget about the human cost.
Exactly. The decisions being made in Washington, Moscow, Beijing, Tokyo, they all have very real consequences for the people living in Ukraine and the surrounding region.
So, putting aside the geopolitics for a second, what do you think is the most likely outcome for those people on the ground? I mean, with all these competing interests, is there any realistic path to peace?
Oh, I wish I had a crystal ball, but, predicting the future is impossible. But based on everything we've talked about and what our sources are saying, I think a negotiated settlement, however difficult it might be to reach, is probably the most likely scenario.
Okay.
Neither side seems capable of, achieving a decisive military victory, and the economic and social costs of a long war are just too high for everyone involved.
Negotiations, huh? But what kind of compromise could actually work? Could Ukraine accept permanent neutrality? Would Russia give up the territory they've already taken? I mean, those seem like fundamental issues.
Those are the key questions. And the answer is, well, they're probably going to depend on a lot of different factors,
Yeah.
how much pressure the West can keep on Russia, how willing Ukraine is to make concessions, and maybe most importantly, what Putin's real goals are.
Yeah, it's so hard to know what he really wants, isn't it? But getting Russia wrong pointed out, his whole worldview has been shaped by years of feeling betrayed by the West.
Right, and that historical context is really important for understanding what's driving him now. Putin wants security guarantees for Russia. He wants to prevent NATO from expanding any further. And he wants to restore what he sees as Russia's rightful place in the world. Whether or not he's willing to compromise on any of that, well, we'll have to see.
So understanding Putin's perspective is essential for finding a way out of this, even if it's hard to do.
Absolutely. We have to grasp his perspective, not to agree with him, but to understand his motivations. That's the only way we can hope to find a lasting peace.
Well, this deep dive has given me and hopefully our listeners a lot to think about as we continue to follow this story. I think the biggest takeaway for me is that there are no easy answers here. This is just a really complex conflict with huge implications.
Well said. And I think what's really important for our listeners is to remember that there's no one right answer, no single narrative that tells the whole story.
Right? Keep questioning, keep learning, keep engaging with different viewpoints.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to challenge assumptions. Really dig deeper, especially when it comes to something as important as war and peace.
Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and keep those critical thinking skills sharp.